Hello and welcome to Tech Report. On this episode, I'm going to give you a brief tour of my main networking rack. I'll show you all of my on-premises servers and give you a brief explanation of what each one does. Recently, I found myself watching a lot of online videos of people showing off routers, servers, and other pieces of their networking equipment. That inspired me to create this video showing off a little bit of my own networking hardware. Without further ado, let's head up to the server room and have a look at the main server rack. Hello and welcome to my server room, which also doubles as a sort of rec room. This is my half-height server rack, and just to talk briefly about the rack itself, is a nice $50 dealie from my local Craigslist. As you can see, it came out of a old Edward Jones data center, but it does the job pretty well, and has, I believe, if I recall correctly, it's 30 U of rack space, something like that. Nice fully encased unit. It's got some nice fans on the back to keep airflow running, 3 of them in total. The fans actually take quite a lot of power. They're 30-watt fans each, but 10-watt fans each. 3 of them together is about 30 watts of power consumption, but they do the job, and because the server rack is completely enclosed like that, it keeps everything nice and ventilated and the air moving. So I'm going to open up the door here, and as you can hear, it gets a little bit louder, but still not too bad. And I guess we'll start at the bottom and work our way up. So down here at the bottom, we've got my 2 internet modems, redundant internet modems. We've got my VDSL modem for our local internet DSL provider, TELUS in my case, and it is a modem router combination. However, I have hacked the firmware on it and put it into bridge mode, so it is acting as a dumb modem. Next to that, I've got my Docsis 2 modem. Most of the stuff in our area has been upgraded to Docsis 3, but I haven't needed the increased speeds, so we're still running on an old Docsis 2 cable modem there. Both of those are redundant, so they fail over to each other, and they actually do load balancing as well. So I've got 25 down and 3 up on both connections, so I get around 45 megabits down and about 5 megabits upload on when they're being load balanced. So both of those feed into my MikroTik RB2011 UAS router, and that is the main central router in my network. That handles pretty much everything on the network. It does the load balancing, it does the NAT for my network, it's also my DHCP server. It does not do DNS. DNS is handled by one of my other servers, but it does pretty much everything else. It's also an IPv6 tunnel endpoint, because we don't have IPv6 natively yet, and it also does serves as a VPN endpoint, because I've got a site-to-site VPN that links my data center in the cloud with my network here at home so they can communicate natively. It's a pretty solid router. It's got a nice little touch screen on the front of it, so you can look at the stats. Right now I'm transmitting and receiving at 8.5 megabits per second, so not too much going on the network. It does have an integrated 10-port switch, which is friggin' awesome for doing stuff. It basically means I don't need an external switch. 5 of the ports are gigabit, 5 of the ports are 100 megabits, so I've got most of my servers plugged into the gigabit ports, and then some of the slower speed things like wireless and so forth plugged into the 100 meg ports. It's a nice 1U rack mount enclosure, and is all in all a really nice router. You can see my uptime there is 3 weeks and change. All right, so moving on up to the first server in my rack, we've got the 4U monster, which actually is not as much of a monster as it looks like. This thing's actually, the reason it's a 4U case is it's loaded up with PCI Express and PCI TV tuner cards. So I've got a free-to-air card in there, I've got an over-the-air card in there, and I've got just a generic capture card to capture from my subscription satellite. And all of that feeds into this puppy. Hardware itself is just a desktop motherboard and a Core i3 processor. Doesn't need a whole lot of processing power because all the video encoding is done on the hardware capture cards themselves. And that basically just takes it in and allows me to stream the TV over my network. If you've looked at some of my previous videos, I have one about setting up live TV on XBMC. This is the server that handles all my TV streaming for XBMC. And that is its only purpose, is to do TV streaming. It's a dedicated box just for that. Didn't spend too much money on it, probably about $400 on all the components, so not too much, fairly lightweight components, but it does the job. I also use it as a light workstation as well sometimes, because I don't have a workstation in this room. So I've just got it fed out to my monitor and keyboard and mouse over there, and I do some just sort of light work on it, internet browsing, that kind of thing. But pretty much it's dedicated for streaming TV. The next server we've got here is much smaller. It's a 2U case, and as you can see, it's got the nice hot swappable drive bays. That is my NAS. That's my network attached storage. It's got four 3 terabyte drives in it, and they're set up in what would be the equivalent of RAID 6. So I'm getting approximately 5.5 terabytes of usable storage space out of it. Now I say the equivalent of RAID 6 because it's not actually RAID 6. It's using RAID Z2, which is the ZFS equivalent of RAID 6. And those of you who know a little bit about computers and servers and that sort of thing are going to say, oh, ZFS, that must be a Solaris or a BSD box. And yes, indeed, it's running FreeBSD version 9. I find that FreeBSD for just as a NAS works extremely well, because that's all it does. It's a NAS, and it handles, it's bound to my Active Directory domain, so it handles domain authentication as well. But that's all it does. It serves up files on the network over SMB and NFS, and then authenticates users against my Active Directory domain controller. And that's pretty much it. It does that really well. The uptime on that server is about 50 days right now, which for me is pretty darn good because I'm constantly tinkering and rebooting things. So that's my NAS, my FreeBSD NAS. Pretty solid machine. The final actual server I've got in here is my generic VMware Esxi virtualization box. This box has an LSI RAID controller in it. It's got 2 disks mirrored to each other, 2 500 gigabyte disks. Don't need a whole lot of disk space on this because it's mainly a development machine. So on this, as I mentioned, it's running VMware Esxi version 5.5 is the host operating system, and then on top of that, I'm running a whole host of VMs. In the last episode, you saw how I installed Mac OS X on VMware Esxi, so this is running a Mac OS X VM on top of that. It's running a Linux VM, which does all my Bitcoin stuff. It's basically my Bitcoin wallet. It has a Windows Server 2012 virtual machine, which is my Exchange server, and it's not really facing the internet, but it does handle email for my LAN and allows me to play around with Exchange 2013. And it's running a second Windows virtual machine, which is also Windows Server 2012, which is my Active Directory domain controller. And I know you guys are thinking, having a domain for what I think I've got 4 or 5 different computers on my network, probably overkill, but it gives me the chance to play with Active Directory. And I've actually discovered that Windows Server is really crippled unless you do have it bound to an Active Directory domain. A lot of features are kind of difficult to play with, so it is running as my Active Directory domain controller as well. And I find it's pretty nice to just make things authenticate against that one central point. So I've got some websites that do authentication against Active Directory and so forth. That's pretty much all that box is running. Let's see if I missed anything. No, it's running my Linux box for Bitcoin Wallet, Mac OS X development server, and 2 Windows boxes for Exchange and Active Directory. So just an all-around development box. Server-grade hardware, server-grade motherboard, server-grade processor. It's got 12 gigs of RAM, non-ECC RAM because I'm cheap. And if it decides to die on me, it's not the end of the world. Just a nice little basic VMware Esxi box. Above that, you see I've got a Bell ExpressView satellite receiver, which is fed into my TV server, so that's where all my subscription satellite comes into. And on top of that, I've also got a D-Link, it's a DIR 825 router. Not configured as a router, that's just configured as a dumb wireless access point. So it's actually on the same physical network as my my MikroTik machine, but this guy is just acting as a dumb wireless access point. And I know a lot of you are saying, well, you're putting a wireless access point inside a tin can. It can't work very well. And it doesn't, but the thing is it doesn't need to work very well because the sole purpose of this access point is to cover this room and my bedroom, which is adjacent to it, and the rest of the house is covered by a separate access point, but this is like the one dead zone. So it works very terribly for being inside, because it's inside a tin can, but it works well enough to cover these two rooms, so it does what it needs, what I need it to. Yeah, so that's pretty much a server of my small but slowly growing equipment rack. I hope to, when I need to upgrade, I'll have a hardware, probably 24-port switch in here, a nice rack mountable unit as well. And, you know, I've got the rack here and I've got the infrastructure in place so I can upgrade as needed. And after having filmed that segment, I did realize that I did forget about a couple of virtual machines on my main Esxi box. There is a OpenBSD virtual machine that basically acts as a public-facing DNS server so that my internal DNS delegation can actually be resolved from the internet. And I also have a Windows 8.1 virtual machine, which I basically use as a terminal server. So whenever I'm doing work outside of my house, I can remote desktop into that server and work in an environment that's comfortable to me, that has all my programs and shortcuts and so forth installed. So those are two virtual machines that I missed when I was giving my explanation in that other video. Additionally, my main domain controller is a bit more than just a domain controller. It also powers my Davis Vantage Pro weather station and collects weather data and allows it to be uploaded to the internet. And it also handles my WhatsApp Pro, which is how I monitor my server rack's power consumption. I have a WhatsApp Pro fed into my domain controller, which then reads the data from it, parses it, and displays it on a web page. The average power consumption of my server rack is 300 to about 330 watts. And if you're interested in checking out any of this stuff, just head on over to ve7alb.net. It's a website that's hosted off of that server rack, actually hosted on my domain controller, and you can check out the weather at my current house, the shot from my webcam, or you can also take a look at the WhatsApp Pro and see what my power consumption is. And that's all for this edition of Tech Report. From all of us at iNet, thanks for watching. I'm Christopher Munns-Micklin, and we'll see you right here next time on Tech Report.